Well, guys, I think it's about time for another episode of Random Star Trek. What do you mean it's been so long since I've talked about Star Trek that this series is no longer relevant? That's just silly. Though, because it has been a while since I made one of these, the first one of these, in fact. Let's go back over the concept very quickly. There's a site online called the Star Trek Randomizer, which, with a push of a button, allows you to play a random episode through your Netflix account of one of the 5 Star Trek series available through that platform. That being the original series, Star Trek The Next Generation, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Voyager, and Star Trek Enterprise. Last time, using the Star Trek Randomizer, we got one of the best possible episodes to start a Star Trek review series with. The original series episode, The Menagerie. Now, typically what I'm going to do is at the end of each of these episodes, I'll actually use the randomizer again to preview which episode we're going to get next. Last time, I completely forgot to do that. So today's review is going to be a surprise. The rule is if I get a episode from a multi-part arc, then I will review all of the episodes together. So let's go ahead and hit the play random episode button and see which episode we're going to be talking about today. Come on, Next Generation or Deep Space Nine. Come on. And click.
On Enterprise, interplanetary relations.
I've never had relations with a member of your species.
Can be very intense.
You have to respond in kind, otherwise they'll take offense.
You people are even uglier than I remember.
Now, they're puppets of a mysterious force that pits species against species.
There will be bloodshed.
Star Trek Enterprise.
Well, that's not exactly what I was hoping for. In case you guys couldn't tell, that's an episode of Star Trek Enterprise, Babel 1. It's interesting how the only Star Trek series shot in high definition has the worst quality trailers available online. That is really the best quality trailer I could find for this episode. And just to get it out of the way right out the gate, this trailer actually perfectly sums up my problems with Enterprise. The showrunners working on Enterprise, primarily Brannon Braga, who was a veteran of Star Trek at this point, just in order to get the series in a form resembling what he wanted it to be, had to assure them they had this whole absolutely ludicrous temporal Cold War plot all planned out ahead of time, which they didn't. And also shoehorn in all this gratuitousness. All this lowest common denominator kind of stuff. Gratuitous sexuality, gratuitous violence. Painful attempts at humor. And at this point, the guys working on this, who had been working on Star Trek for as long as they had been, for entire other series preceding this one, in a couple of cases, they were just burned out on the concept. The 3rd season of Enterprise, for example, was a whole war survival arc. The Earth has come under threat, and Enterprise is the only ship that can save them, must travel through hostile space under almost constant attack for the entire season. And that's when the show actually started to get good. Season 3 was the first season of Enterprise that had more good episodes than bad ones. And that was closer to what Brannon Braga wanted to do in the first place. But no, the network forced him and the rest of his crew to cater to the lowest common denominator, making generic Star Trek stories, with the gratuitousness pumped up to 11. And so it's no wonder that the first season of Enterprise are a slog to get through. They're just not good. Now, Enterprise has other failings that aren't really the network's fault. The characters just aren't all that great. That is the fault of the writers, as the characters conceptually are just not wonderful. They are leagues below even the characters on Voyager, which is often considered to be the worst Star Trek series after this one. At least out of these 5. Enterprise was often plagued with characterization that was completely backwards, with character development being plot-driven rather than character-driven, and so the likability, believability, and viability of the characters suffered in many ways because of that. You didn't have a cast of characters reacting as pre-established characters with pre-established personalities. You had characters whose characterization was dictated by the actions happening around them, so that their characterization was never consistent to begin with. Thankfully, the episode that we drew today, Babel 1, is from Enterprise's 4th season. The 4th season of Enterprise is good. Like, there's still some rough episodes. The premiere was garbage, for example. But the season overall is really good. Enterprise is a prequel set before any of the other shows, even that 6th show that I'm not mentioning. And so it always had this huge potential to show how the universe of Star Trek as we know it came to be. Season 4 is where the show finally started to try to do that. And Babel 1 is probably the best example of that, and probably my favorite episode of Enterprise overall. The opening of this episode is brilliant. We are given a cold open on the destroyed bridge of an alien ship, and it takes us just a second to realize that it's an Andorian ship, the Andorians being a recurring race of aliens in the Star Trek universe. And the Andorians had appeared at this point in Enterprise more than any other show. So if you're someone who follows Enterprise, you're bound to know who they are and how important they are. And if you're a Star Trek fan overall, you'll know how important they are to this universe, as one of the founding member species of the United Federation of Planets, the good guy organization, for lack of a better term, within Star Trek's continuity. We continue to pan through this destroyed ship until the camera finally settles upon Shran, a recurring Andorian character and someone who's become an ally to the Enterprise crew and a friend to the captain. Shran is an excellent character, one of the most consistently great characters throughout the series. Played by veteran Star Trek character actor Jeffrey Combs, he's always a treat to have on screen. His ship is being utterly pummeled by a Tellarite ship, another one of the Federation's founding member species, a race that the Andorians haven't really gotten on well with in the past. So let's recap. If you're someone who only follows Enterprise, you're immediately invested because you know this character and you like him. And if you're someone who follows Star Trek, your investment is doubled because of the meaning that this has for the series overall. The plot of this episode is actually fairly simple. Enterprise is carrying some Tellarite delegates to the planet Babel, a planet well known from the original series as an important site in the original negotiations, which led to the formation of the Federation. They're supposed to meet there on neutral ground with some Andorian representatives and hammer out a new trade agreement. Something pretty simple and beneficial to both sides, though you can understand why there would be backlash against this, as these are two groups who have been in conflict for a long time. But the Andorians have superior technology to the Tellarites. When Captain Archer and his crew pick up the distress call from Shran's ship and go to rescue him, bringing Shran and his few surviving crew members aboard, including his mate, he is very quick to point that out, that a Tellarite ship should not have been able to get the best of his ship, the Kumari. In one of many absolutely fantastic dramatic scenes in this episode, Shran and Archer sit down and drink to Shran's ship, and he talks about his ship and crew. And you kind of get the sense that this was the Andorian Enterprise and crew, that these were the best of the best that Andor had to offer. Heroes to their people, akin to not Archer and his Enterprise. Archer and his Enterprise are a crappy sack of crap sacks, but like Kirk and his Enterprise. It's a touching scene. These guys, these Andorian characters, have been mainstays throughout most of the show at this point. The Kumari has had multiple meaningful interactions with Enterprise in the past. In any other Star Trek show, that would mean that even if they're not mentioned often, Shran, his crew, and his ship are going to be around throughout the entire series. This tells us immediately that the status quo is being shaken up, something which is almost unheard of in a show like Enterprise. In fact, one of the major Season 4 arcs, which I imagine we'll get to eventually, was all about maintaining the status quo. So even within Season 4, this is a standout episode, at least in terms of its basic concept. Shran is of course upset to learn that there are Tellarites on the ship. Archer protects them though, because there's no way that these Tellarites are responsible for what happened. And then we get to the real intrigue of this episode. We're introduced to a mystery plot. Obviously some stuff was still functioning on the Kumari, that's how people were able to survive over there. That means that when Enterprise goes and picks up the remains of Shran's crew, they're able to download some information from the Kumari's sensors, including the power signature of the ship which attacked them. It's pretty much immediately after the drink between Archer and Shran that this mystery element slaps this episode right in the face. Now Enterprise comes under attack by a ship that seems to be of the Kumari class, an Andorian warship. Enterprise, being a barely functional, glorified tugboat half the time, of course gets its ass handed to it by this supposed Andorian ship. So having Shran on board, they try the old trick of using his knowledge against the enemy. He gives the Enterprise gunners the weak points of the Andorian ship so they can disable it. But that fails. And yet everything about this ship says that it is an Andorian ship. Its hull configuration, its weapon signatures, everything is Andorian. It isn't until a fault with the technology on that other ship causes it to retreat that Enterprise, her crew, and Shran himself get some time to breathe and think over this encounter. Jumping ahead a little bit in the episode, they do eventually determine that somehow, remarkably, this Andorian ship has the same power signature as the ship that attacked the Kumari. So even though they look completely differently, read completely differently, have completely different weapon signatures, they're somehow the same ship. The scene that immediately follows this one, though, is a sit-down between Archer, Shran, and the Tellarite ambassador. Shran and the ambassador are aggressive towards each other. They're both aggressive species in general, so of course they're going to be aggressive towards each other. They've been at odds for generations. They don't like each other, and they're both aggressive people. And yet, one of the best things, no, actually I'd say the best thing about this episode is the way the actors play these characters. You can tell, you can see in their body language that they want this conflict to end, that they're tired of it. Shran wants revenge for what happened to his ship and crew, and yet he's still tired of this. And having Archer on hand to play referee between these two people finally begins to give them something of an excuse to begin to put this long-standing aggression aside and just let it all go, to move beyond it. But peace takes a long time, so both sides end up conspiring against each other, of course, and this is where some of the clips from that god-awful trailer come into play. Shran's girlfriend, whose name I do not remember, and I feel really bad about that, does at one point try to seduce her way out of lockdown in her quarters so that she can go and attack the Tellarites. That does happen, but thankfully they subvert the trope and it doesn't work. Like, she still gets out and does the stuff that she wanted to do, Shran goes with her, but it doesn't work. Thankfully, the Enterprise crew does manage to step in and prevent any of the Tellarites from becoming seriously hurt, but unfortunately, because of their intervention, Shran's girlfriend is shot. It's a superficial wound, but she's still shot. And there is still some risk to her. So again, the presence of the Enterprise crew has prevented things from getting as bad as they could have gotten. But things between these two groups are still tenuous. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, the Enterprise crew is still trying to work out exactly what this ship is that attacked them. It's suggested that it could be a Romulan ship, because this otherwise great episode can't be perfect for some reason, I guess. It is confirmed for us that it is a Romulan ship when we get to see into its bridge. We learn that this is basically a stripped down Romulan warbird, leaving behind nothing but the power systems and the engines, with a whole bunch of adaptive weaponry stuck onto the front of it so that it can simulate the weapons of other ships, and holo emitters so that it can look like them. And I think this is honestly the biggest weakness of the episode. We do get the perspective of this other crew as they're playing their little cat and mouse game with Archer and Enterprise. Enterprise does eventually come upon this ship again when its holographic camouflage is down and managed to get a couple of main characters onto it. And while none of the Enterprise crew members see a Romulan in this episode, and therefore continuity is preserved, because no human sees a Romulan for something like 100 years after when this episode is set, I think showing the audience for sure that this was the Romulans was a mistake. I think it takes away from the intrigue of the episode. We didn't need the Romulan perspective. Let the Enterprise crew guess that this could be a Romulan ship, and leave it at that. I think that just works so much better. Makes the intrigue and the suspense so much stronger. Because, in hindsight, Star Trek fans will know, looking back on this episode, why the Romulans would be interested in preventing these trade dispute negotiations from happening. The Romulans are experts at political intrigue. They might be able to foresee that peace between these two groups might eventually bring an even stronger peace, something like the Federation that we get later, which would be a major threat to them. Let's say you are just a fan of Enterprise and you're watching this episode and you don't know the greater scheme of the continuity and where this fits in it. The events of this episode might inspire you to go watch more Star Trek, and then you could go back later and piece all of that together retroactively and work it out for yourself, and you'd get that great sense of satisfaction. But instead, the writers on this episode felt the need to just straight up tell us the answer. And I really don't appreciate that. And I really don't like where this episode leaves off either, because, spoiler alert, this is a cliffhanger episode. This is actually a 3-part arc. But because it's 3 parts, and they're all pretty complex episodes, I am going to be breaking them up into 3 different reviews. This episode actually leaves off with the reveal that the Romulan crew that we've been following are not on this ship. It is revealed to us 100% that they're back on the Romulan homeworld controlling this ship remotely. And that's why they've been having problems with it, because the control systems aren't syncing up properly or some techno-babbly thing. And again, don't show us that. It would be so much stronger if we weren't shown the Romulan crew to begin with and we weren't shown where they were. It is a huge weakness of the first 2 episodes in this arc, that we see the Romulan perspective on things. And to be fair, the 3rd episode in the arc wouldn't work without it, but I'm of the mind that you don't need the 3rd episode in this arc anyway, so we'll talk about that when we get to it. Let's just move on. This episode is great. In terms of just general quality and continuity, probably the best episode of Enterprise. It may have seemed like I glossed over a few things in this review, mostly most of the character interactions in the episode, but that's on purpose. I mentioned earlier that for the most part, Enterprise is a very plot-driven show. The characters make choices dependent entirely on the necessity of the plot, rather than their own characterization. And I feel that this is, if not the first, then one of the first episodes of Enterprise where that mentality takes a whole 180 and the characters start to behave as characters first. And because of that, and because the writing of this is so strong, and because it's paced as a 3-part episode, and so you don't have to cram the whole plot of the story into just this one, you can draw things out more, there are tons of great, nuanced character interactions all throughout this episode. And I don't want to spoil that for anybody who goes and watches this episode because of this review. I don't even know a better term for it, the battle weariness that we see in Shran and the Tellarite ambassador, the genuine impression that the weight of this conflict has left upon them, is palpable and it's meaningful. There's a theme in this episode of this third party being exactly what these two groups need. This third group, Archer and his crew, are a mostly objective third party. They don't want to see anybody hurt, and they don't want to see either side's goals furthered if those goals are to harm someone else. You get the very palpable sense throughout this entire episode that even if it isn't specifically Archer and his crew, or even specifically Earth and humanity, the injection of new blood into this scenario is exactly what they need to find peace, even if it's not immediate. And so you get to see the mentalities, the relationships, which are the first building blocks in the foundation of the Federation being built. And as a Star Trek fan, you have no idea how meaningful that is. This is exactly what Enterprise should have been from the beginning. I alluded to another arc in Season 4, the Augments arc. If you've watched Enterprise and know anything about the overall continuity of Star Trek, you'll understand why that one's important. That is a great arc. It's sort of a fix arc. It fixes one of the continuity issues in Star Trek. And I'm glad that it's there, but it pales in comparison to this. Getting to actually witness how the universe of Star Trek comes to be the universe of Star Trek should always have been the goal of this show. And despite myself, I'll always have some resentment for the people responsible for it not managing to be that. Overall, I'm not a fan of Enterprise. I think it's a pretty bad show for the most part. But this 4th season, and especially episodes like this, leave me feeling genuinely sad that the 4th season ended up being the last. But as per usual, guys, I'd like to know, what do you think of this episode of Star Trek Enterprise, if you have seen it? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. The fact that this is part 1 in a 3-parter does of course necessitate that my next 2 Star Trek reviews will be reviews of the next 2 parts, which bums me out because the main reason I decided to review these randomly was so I'd get some variety between episodes. But what are you gonna do? Either way, this has been AJ22 and I will talk to you guys later.